going?
Can I say one thing to Heather?
Oh, well, you're live. You can say whatever you want.
We'll save it.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hi. Thanks for I think that all three of us have the giggles right now. We've just gone through a emotional roller coaster of technical difficulties, but we are here and we are very happy to be here with all of you. My name is Beth Spotswood. I am Alta's digital editor. Thank you for joining us for episode 12, a dozen of Alta Asks Live. This is the digital version of Alta Asks, an author interview series we do at altaonline.com. Today, our interviewer is the fabulous author, teacher, book critic, and Alta contributor, my now friend. I work with her, Heather Scott Partington. She's here to speak with author Rishi Reddi. Today, Rishi is here to discuss her book, Passage West, among other exciting things. Their chat, as usual, is going to last about 30 minutes. While you're watching, please ask questions for Rishi or Heather. They're not going to bother. It won't distract them. I'll be the one kind of gathering the questions. So please do post your questions for them and we'll try and get to them at the end. We encourage you to learn about Alta. If you're unfamiliar with us, you can join us and receive Alta. We're a quarterly magazine, so 4 issues a year for $24 a year. And don't forget, now more than ever, it's really important to support our authors and independent booksellers. So there should be a button right underneath us. You can click to consider buying Passage West from independent bookstores. Stick around again for a Q&A session at the end. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Heather and Rishi.
Thanks, Beth.
Thank you, Beth.
Rishi, welcome.
Thank you, Heather. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
You wrote such a wonderful novel, and I'm really excited today that I get to pick your brain about it a little bit, because it's sort of amazing how many characters and years and everything that it encompasses. And I don't know if our audience knows, you are not from California, but this is a very California novel. So I'm excited to talk about that today.
I'm not from California, but when my family first moved to the United States, California is the first place we moved to. We lived in Hollywood and we were there for a couple of years. So it was the first landing spot for us in this country.
And can you tell everybody where you are now?
I am in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just a few blocks from Harvard University and from the Charles River.
Great. So, and also, can you tell them a little bit about your other job? In addition to being an author, you have a pretty all-encompassing other job as well.
I do have a day job. I work in the field of environmental justice for our state government. I've worked in environmental law in the environmental justice field for a long time now. So that's been my J job all throughout the writing of this novel and before.
Can you talk a little bit about how the idea for this book came to you, and how many years you spent writing this project?
Yeah, the book took me about 12 years to write and research actively. I first had the idea for the book when I was in law school a long time ago, and we had read a case called Bhagat Singh Thind versus U.S., and the case was about Mr. Thind, who was a Sikh man from then British India. And he had lived in the United States for a while and was trying to gain U.S. citizenship, naturalization, because he had served in the U.S. Army during World War I. So I hadn't known about this case before my time in law school. So when I read about it, and then how he had been granted citizenship, and then after a while, his citizenship was appealed by the Naturalization Service and revoked, so he was left stateless. This was the case that we studied, and it was very interesting to me. So I started researching that time and about how South Asians had been in the US during that time, and that's what led to the novel finally.
It's wonderful. How did you go about your research for this is a very heavily researched book. It includes a lot of American history from the time and California history, land law, miscegenation laws. there's so much in this book that actually happened, and your fictional narrative is woven so nicely between these actual historical events. What kind of how did you do that research for the book?
Well, I first started out looking at newspapers and periodicals and magazines that had been written at the time that these immigrants had come in, so the 1910s and the 1920s. And then I got sidetracked because I found out about the political movement called the Ghadar Party, which were led by South Asians who had left the Indian subcontinent and come to America, and were therefore able to lobby from outside of the British Empire for freedom for the Indian subcontinent. So I started to read a lot of sort of scholarly articles about that. But how the novel actually came together is when I met the grown children of these early immigrants. When I was first talking to them in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, they were in their 60s and 70s. And their fathers were the ones who had come over to the US in the 1910s and 20s, and they had married wives who had crossed the border and come from Mexico. And when I met these real life people who had lived these amazing, tricultural lives, that's really what was the heart and soul of the book, and how the story came together. There's a lot of real things that happened in that book. So a lot of the things that are, the news, the excerpts that are put in the form of letters or in the form of newspaper articles and clippings were real ones that I had read. I mean, I folded them into the fictitious town of Fredonia, but the newspaper article actually really did appear, or the song lyrics really did appear. So I tried to fold it in that way.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about the area of California that most of the novel is centered around?
Yeah, so it's set in the Imperial Valley, and that valley started to become settled right at the turn of the 20th century. And then settlers came in around 1904 and started this grand project of surface irrigating that land off of the Colorado River. And through this surface irrigation, all of these towns sprouted up in the Imperial Valley. And it was originally meant to be a new land where family farms could grow and support these small towns, families in these small towns. And sort of over the course of two or three decades, agribusiness came in. The small family farmers left. Many of those were the immigrant farmers that were actually forced out. But when those immigrant farmers were forced out, instead of that land being taken over by a lot of the white family farmers, in fact, agribusiness used that as the opportunity to step in and buy up huge swaths of land. So the way that was originally conceived of as being sort of this all-American, Theodore Roosevelt sort of, we're going to come in and support our American families, is not really what happened. It was really that it became a big business scenario. So that was interesting too. And I tried to follow that narrative as well over the course of the book.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about this book, well, I enjoyed so many things, but it's a big story. There are a lot of characters. There are a lot of characters from many different backgrounds who were living in that area at the time. And one of the things that I think is really powerful about the book, and David Hewlin mentions this in his review at Alta also, is that it became about who gets to tell certain stories. And I grew up in California. There's so much about the history of these immigrants from India living in Southern California at the time, and also some of what occurred prior up in the Pacific Northwest we are not taught in public schools. What is the reaction been as people have read the novel? Has that been something that people have said to you? And I guess I'll just ask you that first question.
It's a great question. It's a great question because I found the reason why I became initially interested in writing about the topic and even researching that case, the Thind case years ago, was because I hadn't known that South Asians were living in the US at that time. And then I'm hearing this comment over and over again from a lot of readers that they just didn't know that there was this whole panoply of folks, the Japanese, the South Asians, and even from all over Europe and Asia and from Africa as well. So this was really interesting to me. But the most interesting part of this is that so many South Asian and Indian immigrants are saying to me, "Wow, we didn't know that our community was here that early," and it sort of changes their sense of being in the United States. To read a book and to meet a part of yourself that existed here more than 100 years ago is really moving for people, and it's very moving for children, especially to read a piece of history and to actually meet yourself there is it's kind of earth-shattering, I would say.
Can you, there are some parts of the novel that take place in Stockton as well, which is kind of up very close to where I am. Can you talk about some of the historical events that you wove into the novel that occur in Northern California?
Yeah, so in Stockton is, so the story centers around a group of Sikh men who are observant followers of the Sikh religion. And in that time, a vast majority of the immigrants from South Asia were followers of Sikhism. And what happened in Stockton is that a group of folks got together and established the first Sikh temple, which is known as a Gurdwara in that area. And they gathered first in 1912, and then they purchased land and were able to erect a building in 1913, 1914. That temple still stands on the land there. The building has shifted and changed a bit, but the site of that temple is still there. And in fact, one of the trees that is said to have been planted by one of the original founders of the temple, it still stands there. I saw that. So the temple houses a lot of that early history. There's printing presses from that Ghadar party, the revolutionary party that was lobbying for freedom from the British. That historic spot is still there, and it was very moving to go back and visit that place and to know that it had that history in the United States. Right there, that early seed of the Indian and Punjabi traditions.
How did World War I change land or citizenship specifically and land ownership for people like your characters who were living in California?
Well, World War I, when it started, President Wilson actually was encouraging a great number of immigrants to enlist in the army and fight in the war and thereby gain their citizenship. And a lot of people followed that. There was a great many immigrants of European ancestry who got their citizenship in that way. What happened in the Imperial Valley and in California in those stories is that after the war was over and the economy started to tank, there was a lot, mainstream America started to look again at folks who may have been seen to be competing with them and taking resources from them that they had previously shared in a bit more generous fashion, maybe not really, but there was a little bit more tolerance. So when the economy tanked after World War I, that's when a lot of this movement about the competitiveness between these minority groups started. So what happened in California is that federal immigration laws started to close off immigration from Asia. And then simultaneously, there were miscegenation laws that didn't allow marriage between the races, so that these men who had come from South Asia couldn't bring over women, they couldn't bring over their wives. And so they were left to build lives in this somewhat difficult circumstances. And that forms the basis for the story.
I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the style that the novel is written in. It's a very fluid style, and because this is such a large story, again, it ends up being this beautiful glimpse at these families over multiple generations. I was wondering if you could talk about who some of your own influences are as a writer and as a reader, Is there anything that you felt like you drew upon in terms of narrative, and just, you know, things that you felt like were formative for you as you began to write?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a great admirer of Toni Morrison and always have been. In particular, so, you know, I often thought of the way that she's treated historical works while I was writing this book as well. Edward P. Jones, The Known World, was a book that I constantly went back to as I was writing this, to see how he had framed this fictitious county, you know, in the context of this real historical moment, and interwove what was real with what he made up, such that at the end of that book, you know, I had no idea that the county didn't really exist at all, you know, as a huge surprise to me. And I think he has said or written before that the idea for his book came from like just a little footnote or a mention of certain types of slaveholders that he was writing about at that time. So in the same way, I kept thinking about, wow, I have these newspaper clippings that are just little windows into a larger life and lifestyle that existed at the time. And I was going to try to use those, and made up this town of Fredonia in the same way, you know, to parallel Brawley or to parallel El Centro, and to pull different things from those towns in. And also, you know, since I was in high school, I've been a huge fan of Mark Twain and the use of dialect, and I wanted to hear those voices on the page. To me, rendering Indian English in the way that, you know, we render any other type, American English, British English, Australian English, is really important. English has been spoken on the Indian subcontinent for as long, if not longer, actually longer than it's been spoken here. And this is something people don't know. I mean, it's part of the Indian terrain, the Pakistani, Bangladeshi terrain, in a way that it is in any of the other colonies, you know, so.
I haven't mentioned this yet, but the story is told as kind of a frame story, and it starts I believe in the 1970s.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, after these men have had this kind of friendship and rivalry for their entire lives, and then goes back to that at the end. Is that influenced by some of your interviews with some of the children of people who lived during this time period in the area of the Imperial Valley?
It definitely was. It was influenced by them. It was also influenced by the time, you know, in my imagining of that population, that was when my family first came to the US, was the early 70s. And I had to find some way to connect with these characters. And I realized that when I was a child walking around, you know, in California, and I would realize that some of the folks that I saw out on the sidewalk or something else were, you know, folks that had come as immigrants that long ago. That was how I made the connection. And that was how I was able to sort of, I don't know, you know, take a hold of the subject in a way. It became important to me to show the span of time. So if I was going to look at the 1970s and then reach all the way back, you know, 50 or 60 years, in the epilogue, I stop in the 1950s. You know, we're reading the story in the 2020s. It was a way to render the length of time that South Asians had been in the US, you know, to follow that narrative all the way through, even though I was just, you know, sort of dropping in at little places. That was what I was trying to do with that framing.
It's really a remarkable story. I would encourage any of our viewers who are fans of the big multi-generational rural novel to pick it up and to give it a read, because it's just phenomenal. Do you have something that you would like to read for us from the novel?
I do, Heather. Yeah, let me give this a try. So I wanted to, well, I thought I might read some. There's the story follows two characters, Ram and Karak. And Ram is the innocent younger man who is very much wanting to go back to Punjab and join his young wife and a son that he has never met, who was born while he was away. And Karak is the second character, who's a bit more colorful and forceful. And he is actually very much wanting to immigrate to the United States and have, you know, really no more ties to his Indian birthplace. And so I'm going to read a excerpt from when he is courting a young Mexican woman named Rosa, who does eventually become his wife. So a few things that I should just state before I read, because I'm plopping you right into the middle of the book, which is that Karak is an observant follower of Sikhism, and he wears the star or the turban. In those days, mainstream America, when they met these men, called them all Hindu, and did not speak of them as Sikh. So just called them Hindu in terms of the entire population, whether they were Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Christian. Karak speaks Spanish because he had spent time in Manila after he had left British service. And in this scene, this is the first date between Rosa and himself. The two of them go on a picnic. He picks her up in a horse-drawn buckboard, which is an old, cheaply formed carriage that many people had in the rural area. And he's very uneasy because he does not really know of any Mexican customs. So Karak came to fetch her in the buckboard, having packed up the food, and they went to the only park east of the tracks, situated between the Negro settlement and Chinatown. When he realized that too many people would be watching them, a turbaned Hindu consorting with a Mexicana, he turned out of town and went along the dirt path that led to the new plank road. He wished he had a machine, one of those new models that were being snapped up more quickly than Ford could make them. That would impress Rosa. He was sure of it. "Why are you courting me?" she asked as they began to eat. His fluency in Spanish came and went. At this question, he stammered, then felt a moment of lightness and laughed when she did. Then he was bothered by that laugh. Was she making fun of him? Did she not think him manly? He had brought roti and beans, trying to cook something close to Mexican food in an effort to show they could be familiar. But Rosa was taunting him, giggling. "I am a Mexican girl, and you are a Hindu." He corrected her, telling her he was Sikh, not Hindu. That was why he wore the dastar. That was why he wore the iron bangle. "Why do they call you Hindu?" she asked. "I do not know." Then he laughed, though he was disheartened by her question. "We are from Hindustan, so we are Hindu, maybe." He looked at her. "We call ourselves Hindustani." She did not seem to understand the nuance. "So I am a Mexican girl and you are a Sikh. Don't we live in America?" he asked, "where we are equal?" "Does equal mean we live like this?" she asked back. Later that afternoon, they drove the buckboard into El Centro. They went as far as the furniture store, where the wealthy Anglos shopped, much farther than they would have wandered on any working day. Through the window, they saw the Persian rugs hanging in the back, a mock room displayed with a home telephone hanging on the wall, a showroom for faucets and sinks. "So many beautiful things," Rosa exclaimed. "I can buy them all for you," he said. She was still looking through the window when she said, dreaming, distracted, "We will have such beautiful children." That was when Karak knew. A moment later, the pink came to her face and she giggled. Her eyes darted around as if she did not know exactly where she was. She had not meant the thought to be articulated. She turned that way. "You feel so sure about me?" he asked. But he was talking to her back. Her hat sat at an innocent angle. "Yes," she whispered. "Why?" "Because of the harvest last spring. I saw how you acted when Senor Cruz fell in the field. You have a good heart, a strong heart. You jumped on the horse and went immediately to fetch the doctor, like a son." Goodwill swept through him. He had not wanted to ride for the doctor for Senor Cruz that day, but as he gazed at Rosa's back and shoulders, he thought he could be who she thought he was. Stop there.
Rishi, thank you. And thank you for joining us at Alta here today. Can you tell people where they can find you if they would like to find out more about your book or to follow you on social media, that type of thing?
Sure. My website's www.rishireddi.com, and there are links there to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. So
wonderful. Thank you so much again. And we're going to bring Beth back so she can ask questions from our viewers.
Thank you, Heather.
Here I come. I'm grabbing your website. A link to Rishi's website right there in the comments. That was, sorry, I got distracted. I was like listening to your So we do have a couple of questions. First of all, yes, someone asked if this recording will be available if you've missed any part of this or want to relive it all. It'll be up on altaonline.com later this afternoon.
All right.
So please look for that. We have a question here, Rishi. How did you choose the name Fredonia? And is there any relationship with the name Fredonia, the setting of a Marx Brothers film?
That's a great question. I've never seen the Marx Brothers film, but when I was looking for a name and I looked up Fredonia, I knew that one existed. And I thought, I just couldn't let it go because of the way of the word free within Fredonia and what I was trying to say through all of the narrative of the novel. So I just decided to keep it. There are other Fredonias in the country. I know that there's another fictitious Fredonia in some other novel somewhere, and there's even a Fredonia for real in California, but I couldn't let it go.
So no to the Marx Brothers.
No. Now I will have to go and look it up tonight.
Well, right now you have to. Julia asks, she first says, I love this beautifully written novel. In addition to what you learned about immigration and the contributions of immigrants in the United States, what do you think you learned about agriculture through your research?
Oh my gosh, I had to learn so much about agriculture. And I spent a lot of my growing up years in Kansas. So I felt ashamed that I didn't know so much about agriculture, having spent so much time there. And then my grandparents were also farmers and agriculturists. So I felt like here I had no idea about how difficult the life was and, what it takes to grow these crops. And I didn't understand the way that humans interface with the plants so that there's control and a give and take between what we help develop in the plant, what the plant gives to us, the way that the food that we eat now is founded in decisions that our foremothers and forefathers made generations ago, 500, 600 years ago to bring out the plants that we're eating now. This was such an education for me, truly fascinating.
Susan asks, given the contributions made by immigrants, what power structures exist that prevent their full acceptance and acknowledgement into American culture?
What power structures exist? Well, there's so many structures. Some of them are very much, they're very explicit, of course, citizenship being the first and foremost, and all of the privileges that come with citizenship and who we allow to become citizens in the country very explicitly that we control through means such as quotas and, when does their interview come up and how many years do you have to wait? But all of there's all of these underlying much more intangible and nuanced factors too about the way that we look at people who speak to us with different accents and how intelligent we think they are, how much we think they have to offer us when what they're saying comes to us through an accent. Or through perhaps a different color skin than we consider to be American. So there's that level of nuance. And then underneath that level of nuance is that many immigrants, not all, but many immigrants grieve the loss of their homeland and those ties and the families, the parents that they've left behind, our first families, the people that we're closest to, the sites that we are, most familiar with, smells, food that we leave behind. And although the world is becoming a smaller place, those are still hard to replicate. So if we're talking about walls put up on both sides, there's some of that too. So it's very multi-layered, all of these walls that are between immigrants and the inhabitants of the country that have already arrived.
Rishi, you are like endlessly listened toable. We're out of time, but people are saying they wish that you could keep reading. It was just.
I wish my teenage daughter thought that, but no.
Well, maybe you'll have to wait until she's 42. Like. All right. So with that, I'm just going to do a little wrap up bookkeeping here, everyone. I really want to thank everyone for tuning in. If you are late to the party, we will have this up later today on altaonline.com. If you are so inclined, you can buy Passage West from the link right below us right now. It'll take you to Bookshop, which supports independent booksellers. Tune in next week. We have a two-part Alta Asks Live. We rescheduled author Eden Lepucki, so she'll be joining us on Tuesday at 12:30. And then on Wednesday, we're excited to welcome author and podcast host Todd Goldberg at 12:30. So please join us for both of those if you can. I want to say a big thank you, of course, to Heather, and a gigantic thank you. Rishi, you are just wonderful and a delight. Thank you both so much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to be here, and I love Alta, so I'm so happy to have been able to be here.
Thanks, Rishi.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.